Now this section, first of all, we are going to learn about how do we handle events in React application. We have already seen though in a sample program here that when you click on this button, that is the onClick, this add value function is getting called. And when this function is called, we have this setCount method, which actually increments the value. So that's how normally we do it. Let's also put a decrement button. So I'm going to take one more button here. And here I'm going to say, for example, decrement value. This also means that I'm going to take another function. So I'll say the next function, and that is going to be the decrement value. And in this, I'm going to reduce the value by 1. That's what we are going to do. Now, I do not need to put this console log, right? So I'll just remove this. Now here, whenever you click on these buttons, it's going to perform this job. So let's go to the browser first and see how does it behave. Let me change the text also. I'll say decrement. Now, when you say increment, it does the increment, and here it says the decrement. This is a normal way to deal with events, that you call the function on a specific event. Let's also try the same code with a different approach. Let's say that we have only one common function. Instead of this add or decrement, how about having only one function, adding or subtracting the value of counter? So let's say I'll create a function called change counter, and this function should do both the increment and decrement. That's what we want. In short, what we want is when we call this button increment or decrement, we call the very same function. In fact, this is the very correct way of doing it, right? Instead of taking two different functions, because this is dealing with the same state. If you have different states, you may have different functions, and it also depends on the program as well. But at least in this case, for sure, you are dealing with the counter, that is increment and decrement. Imagine you have more operations on the counter. So you should not have multiple functions for each operation, generally. Instead, what you would prefer is you will pass parameters. So at the moment, what you can do is you can simply, let's say here you pass the operation that is plus, and here you might say minus, right? So you have the plus and minus, two different type of operations, and this is passed here in this function. So I'll say operator or operation. And here now I can put an if condition. I'll say, what is the value of operation? Is it plus? Then I want to say set count, right? I'll say I plus 1, simple. Else, either I say minus or I do not say, doesn't matter, because there are only two conditions. So instead of checking it, I'll simply put an else here, and I'm going to say set count I minus 1, that's it. Now, there is no error as such when we run this code, and this logically is absolutely fine. But if I open the browser to see the output, and if I open the developer tool also, you see that there is some problem getting generated. The problem here is that when you are writing a function like this, what happens is when the component is rendered, because you have these parentheses here, that means on the load of this particular component, these functions are executed. These functions should not be called immediately when the component is loaded. But the moment you have these parentheses, that means it is going to call the function even on load of this component. So what you should do, instead of calling the function, it should return the function, which is called at a later stage. Now, you should know here what is a function expression in JavaScript. Let me quickly remind you that when you say a function expression, that means if let's say you have a function, so you say const test is equal to, you write a function like this. When you do this, it means you are assigning this entire function to a name called test. This function expression is not called when you write these lines. So the similar thing here, that this function should be returned, right? So what I can do, I can simply write a return statement and return the function. But actually, when you are using this particular syntax, that is the arrow function. In arrow function, you do not need to write return statement. See this. This is how you can write it. But it's a single line arrow function. So in single line arrow function, you don't need the return statement at all. So in both the cases, the moment you have parameters passed in the event, you are not going to write it directly. Instead, you are going to put these arrow functions so that it returns the function. It doesn't call it. And whenever the button is clicked, at that time, it should call. So let me just cancel this thing. Now, if I click here, you see, now it's working absolutely fine. So when it comes to event handling, you have two ways. One is that you write directly change counter, provided you do not have any parameters to pass. But if you have parameters to pass, then it should return the function, right? It should not be called on the load. There is also another way. You can use a method called bind, but that we will see at a later stage. At least for now, you see that this function is now working fine. So you need to remember whenever you have parameters to be passed in the function, do make sure that you put an arrow. It should return the function in short. And because arrow has a facility where you don't need to write return statement if you put it in a single line. So that's why you write this way. Let's talk about the questions. The first question is, how do you write events? We have already seen that, like in this piece of code, you see that we have a button and we write the onClick event. So the important point here is that we have the onClick event with different spelling. In JavaScript, we have small c, but here we have capital C. In fact, there is a reason. There is a concept of synthetic event, which we will discuss in forthcoming sections when we dive deeper into events. But here we try to understand the basics. So the thing is, onClick, you just give an equal to sign and you put the curly bracket and you write the function name there. On that particular event, whatever function you have written inside this curly bracket, that is being called. The second question is, how do you pass parameters with event handling? Now, this is very important to know how the event handling changes its behavior when you are passing a parameter, and that we already saw that if you have a function like this, there is no problem. But the moment you pass a parameter, let's say a value, then the problem starts. The reason is whenever the component is loaded, because you have placed brackets here, it starts executing on load. Now you don't want that. So whenever you have parameters, then you do have to make sure that you return the function rather than calling the function like this. So the ideal way, we already saw that we have the arrow function and we can write the return statement, but because in the arrow function, if there is a single line, we do not need to write return. So we don't keep the return here. So whenever there is parameter passing, you write the function like this, where the function is actually getting returned, and it is called when the event is clicked and not when the component is loaded.